Judge Thomas Carter strode into his courtroom with his usual sense of purpose. At 58, he had seen it all: petty thefts, traffic violations, landlord disputes, but today's docket was particularly light. He was looking forward to a quick, efficient session, the kind that didn't stir any drama. His courtroom was one of order, structure, and predictability. Judge Carter had a reputation for being firm, even strict, but fair. He believed in upholding the law, no exceptions, and his no-nonsense approach had earned him respect, if not affection, over the years. As the courtroom filled, he took his seat behind the bench, his robe falling neatly around his shoulders. The usual shuffle of papers, the low murmur of attorneys and defendants, it all felt familiar. Among them was a young woman who caught his eye. Maya Sinclair, standing at the front of the room, was dressed in a smart but understated outfit, a simple blazer, a crisp blouse, and dark slacks. She looked poised, composed, but there was something in her posture that hinted at an undercurrent of tension, a subtle tightness in her shoulders. She wasn't like most of the other defendants. The young woman held herself with an air of calm confidence that set her apart. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the sharp intelligence in her gaze. But to Judge Carter, she appeared almost out of place here, like someone who belonged in a different setting, perhaps in a higher court or a boardroom, not facing a traffic fine. As the case was called, Maya approached the stand, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor. Her lawyer had already presented her argument. She had been speeding, yes, but it was a simple mistake, one that she didn't notice until it was too late. She had been running late for an important meeting, trying to make up time after an unexpected delay. The usual excuse, Judge Carter thought. Not that he had much patience for such claims. Maya Sinclair, Judge Carter said, peering down at her from his bench. You're charged with speeding in a restricted zone. How do you plead? Maya stood tall and met his gaze, her voice steady as she spoke. Guilty, Your Honor, but I would ask for leniency. I didn't realize the speed limit had dropped so suddenly. I wasn't trying to break the law. It was an honest mistake. Judge Carter nodded but didn't seem impressed. He had heard this explanation countless times, and it rarely changed his decision. He glanced at the clock. This case was taking too long, and he had a full day ahead. Your record shows no previous violations, but that won't change the fact that you broke the law. A fine is warranted. Maya nodded again, her face unreadable. She'd known it was coming. She wasn't here to argue with the law, just to make her case. The fine, while frustrating, would be something she would have to accept. $50, Judge Carter said with a swift motion of his gavel. Case closed. Maya felt a brief pang of frustration, but hid it well. She turned to leave the stand, her mind already shifting to the next task ahead. What she didn't know, what no one in the courtroom knew, was that this seemingly ordinary encounter would soon become anything but. Maya stood quietly as Judge Carter made his ruling, the words hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. $50. It wasn't a crippling fine, but the principle of it gnawed at her. She had tried to explain herself, tried to offer a glimpse of the stress she was under, but the judge had been quick to dismiss it all. He had made his decision without a second thought, and she could feel the sting of his indifference. The room slowly began to empty as the case was wrapped up. Maya stood there for a moment, her lawyer already gathering his papers, when something caught her attention. The murmurs in the courtroom had shifted, an undercurrent of whispers that grew louder as more people took notice of who was standing in the front. It was as if the energy in the room had suddenly changed direction, but Maya couldn't place why. She gathered her things with quiet efficiency, ignoring the curious glances that flicked in her direction. It wasn't until she turned to leave that she saw the reporter standing near the back of the room. He was scanning the list of cases for his next story, his pen hovering above his notebook. But then he froze. His gaze snapped back to her, and she knew, instantly, that he recognized her. Maya felt a slight tension in her chest. She was used to being recognized in professional circles, of course. But the last thing she wanted right now was attention. Not here, not now. She had just been handed a fine, after all. She wasn't here to be a spectacle. The reporter, however, couldn't seem to resist. "Wait, you're Maya Sinclair, right?" he asked, stepping forward with a curious gleam in his eye. Maya glanced at him, slightly surprised, but nodded. "Yes, that's me." There was a pause, a moment of hesitation before the reporter spoke again, his voice now more deliberate, as if piecing together something larger. "You're the youngest federal judge in the country, aren't you? Just appointed, right?" Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. A quiet flush of warmth spread through her cheeks, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. She wasn't someone who flaunted her achievements. She had worked hard to get where she was. But that didn't mean she wanted to broadcast it to a courtroom full of strangers, especially now. The reporter's words were enough to spark a ripple across the room. Whispers began to build, first soft, then louder, as the people in the courtroom, those who had been more concerned with their own cases than with the young woman before them, suddenly began to realize who she was. They exchanged glances, and Maya felt their eyes shift from mild curiosity to something more. Judge Carter, still seated behind his bench, hadn't caught the shift in the room's energy until now. He had been sorting through his papers, preparing to move on to the next case. But the quiet murmurings from the crowd drew his attention. He glanced up from his desk, his brow furrowing as he saw Maya standing near the reporter, surrounded by a newfound buzz. His eyes narrowed. Something was different, but he couldn't quite place it. The familiar sound of a gavel hitting wood filled the air as Judge Carter cleared his throat, signaling the courtroom's attention. But the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. Something had changed, and it was bigger than just a traffic fine. Maya Sinclair's presence in his courtroom was no longer just about a simple case. It was about to become something far more significant. The noise in the courtroom grew louder as the realization spread like wildfire. People whispered urgently to one another, trying to piece together the truth of what they had just witnessed. The young woman they had all dismissed as just another defendant was someone entirely different. The undercurrent of surprise was palpable as the word spread, not just among the gallery, but across the room, reaching Judge Carter's ears. He sat quietly at the bench, his expression unreadable, but his mind was racing. Maya Sinclair. The name stirred something in him. A vague recollection of a recent headline, a young lawyer's meteoric rise. But it wasn't until the reporter repeated her title aloud that it hit him. The youngest ever federal court appointee. A title that carried weight. A title that placed Maya among the nation's most respected legal minds. The realization made him pause, his pen frozen mid-scribble. Maya Sinclair wasn't just any young woman with a minor speeding infraction. She was a force in the legal world, an up-and-coming star whose career had already captured national attention. And here she was, standing in his courtroom, facing the same consequences as any ordinary citizen for a mistake she'd made. Judge Carter's gaze locked onto her, and for the first time since the trial began, he saw her differently. It was as if a veil had been lifted. Maya was no longer just a name on a docket to him. She was a person, a formidable one at that. His eyes drifted back to the papers in front of him, but the words blurred for a moment. How could he have missed it? How could he have failed to recognize the person standing in front of him? He had imposed a fine on someone who was shaping the very system he upheld. The weight of that fact pressed down on him, heavy and unsettling. Maya remained calm, almost unfazed by the newfound attention swirling around her. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her now, the silent hum of recognition buzzing in the air. She hadn't wanted this moment to play out this way. She hadn't wanted anyone to know who she was, not in the context of a speeding ticket, not like this. She hadn't asked for the recognition. She was simply trying to live her life and do her job. But the spotlight had a way of finding you, even when you least expected it. As Maya gathered her things, her lawyer gave her a sympathetic glance. He had seen the shift too. The way the energy in the room had suddenly shifted from mundane to electric. He knew exactly what had just happened. He had expected her to rise to the occasion, but now he could see she wasn't fazed. She was used to being underestimated, used to being seen as too young or too inexperienced to handle the weight of her position. Judge Carter was still staring at her, but his expression had softened. Gone was the sternness of the previous moments. In its place was something more complicated, regret, perhaps, or simply the realization that he had made an error in judgment. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room. And in that split second, Maya saw the flicker of awareness in the judge's face, an acknowledgement that what he had just done wasn't as simple as he had initially thought. As Maya made her way out of the courtroom, her steps felt measured, deliberate, despite the rising tension in the air. She was trying to stay composed, but it was impossible to ignore the mounting stares and whispers from the other people in the room. Judge Carter's gavel had already struck, signaling the end of the case, but his mind was still reeling. He stared at the papers in front of him, the words beginning to blur again. Maya Sinclair, federal court judge, the youngest to ever hold such a prestigious title. How had I not known? He thought. How had I missed it? His usual routine had been upended in a matter of minutes. He had issued a fine to someone whose accomplishments were far beyond his own, someone who, just a few months ago, had likely been the subject of national headlines. And yet there he had sat, issuing his judgment as if she were just another defendant, just another young person trying to make her way through the legal system. The weight of the situation hit him harder than he'd expected. The courthouse slowly emptied, the noise of departing footsteps muffled by his racing thoughts. Judge Carter remained seated, rubbing his temples, trying to focus but feeling the gravity of his mistake settle deeper. He had made his decision quickly, reflexively, without considering who Maya Sinclair really was, or what she represented. For a few long moments, the courtroom was quiet except for the sounds of the janitor sweeping the floor. Then, a knock on the door to his chambers broke the stillness. It was his clerk, a young woman named Alice, who had been working with him for the past 5 years. She looked at him carefully, noting his disheveled appearance and the way he seemed lost in thought. "Your Honor." Alice's voice was tentative, as if unsure how to approach him. Judge Carter glanced up, his eyes tired, and gestured for her to enter. "Is everything all right, sir?" Alice asked. She had never seen him quite like this before, disheveled, unsettled. Normally, he was the picture of composure, authoritative and stern. He shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "I made a mistake, Alice. A big one." Alice's eyes widened, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What do you mean?" I just find Maya Sinclair," he said slowly, his voice heavy with a mix of disbelief and regret. "She's not just some young driver in a courtroom. She's the youngest federal court appointee in the country. I didn't recognize her. I treated her like any other defendant." Alice stood there in stunned silence for a moment, the significance of the situation sinking in. She knew about Maya Sinclair, of course. Who didn't? The news of her appointment had been everywhere, and her rise in the legal world had been one of the most talked about stories of the year. Are you going to do something about it?" Alice asked, her voice soft. She didn't know how to approach the situation, but she knew enough to understand that this wasn't just about a fine anymore. Judge Carter's shoulders slumped, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. He had always believed in justice and fairness, but now he was left questioning whether he had really practiced what he preached. He had overlooked Maya's background, her accomplishments, and her potential. He had let his biases, unintentional as they may have been, dictate his judgment, and it gnawed at him. "I don't know, Alice, but I need to fix this. I need to make things right," he said, his voice laced with determination. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Maya Sinclair had walked out of his courtroom earlier today as just another defendant to him. But now, he knew, She was someone who deserved far more than just an apology. The following days after her brief courtroom encounter felt strangely uneventful to Maya. The media had picked up on the story of the youngest federal court appointee in the country being fined for a speeding violation, but Maya chose to keep a low profile. The headlines came and went, but the scrutiny was nothing new to her. Throughout her rise in the legal world, she had grown accustomed to being in the public eye, to being the subject of both admiration and doubt. Maya wasn't bothered by the attention. She was used to people underestimating her because of her age, her gender, or her race. They assumed she couldn't possibly understand the weight of the responsibility she now carried, that she had been granted her position through some form of favoritism or circumstance. She had been pushed to prove herself time and time again. That was why, even though she had been dismissed so casually by Judge Carter, she hadn't allowed it to shake her. Still, it wasn't easy. It never was. Her thoughts wandered back to the courtroom encounter as she sipped her coffee in the quiet of her apartment. She had no intention of confronting Judge Carter or making a big deal out of it. The fine, though frustrating, was a small matter in the grand scheme of things. But what bothered her was the way the entire situation unfolded. She knew it wasn't just about the fine. It was the way she had been seen, or rather not seen. To the judge, she was a faceless defendant, just another name on a docket. But to her, that moment felt like an opportunity lost. It made her wonder how many other young, ambitious people in her position had been judged too quickly, without the chance to prove their worth. Yet Maya didn't let these thoughts distract her for long. She had work to do. The next day, she was back in her office, reviewing cases, preparing for meetings, keeping a close eye on the injustices that still plagued the system she was working to change. She couldn't afford to be bogged down by the past, no matter how recently it had occurred. Her work was too important, and it would take more than a speeding ticket to knock her off course. But there was one thing Maya couldn't shake, the thought that she had been seen through a lens that was narrow and incomplete. It was a thought she carried with her quietly, but it lingered at the back of her mind, as though waiting for the right moment to resurface. And that moment came sooner than she had expected. Several days after the hearing, Maya received a phone call from the courthouse. The voice on the other end was familiar, but unexpected. It was Judge Carter's office. "Good afternoon, Miss Sinclair," the voice said. "Judge Carter would like to speak with you, if you're available. He's requested a meeting." Maya raised an eyebrow, unsure what to make of this. She wasn't angry, but she hadn't anticipated this kind of outreach either. "What's this about?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. The voice hesitated. "He'd like to apologize in person." Maya paused. An apology. A sincere one, perhaps. She wasn't sure what to expect, but one thing was clear. This was going to be a conversation that would change the course of things. She agreed to the meeting, curious about what Judge Carter had to say. The meeting with Judge Carter was scheduled for the following afternoon in a small conference room near the courthouse. Maya arrived on time, her posture as composed as ever, though the curiosity about the purpose of the meeting lingered in the back of her mind. She had expected a quiet apology, perhaps a brief acknowledgement of the judge's mistake, but she wasn't prepared for the gravity in his voice when she entered the room. Judge Carter was already seated at the table when Maya walked in, his usual stern demeanor softened by a look of genuine remorse. He stood up as she entered, a slight shift in his posture signaling a change from the professional authority she had seen in the courtroom. "Maya," he began, his voice uncharacteristically calm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Please, have a seat." Maya nodded but didn't sit immediately. She remained standing for a moment, studying him carefully. She had always believed in the importance of humility in leadership, but seeing Judge Carter's vulnerability in person was something new. It made her pause. She had seen him as a figure of unwavering authority, a symbol of the old system she had committed herself to change. But now, sitting across from him, she saw something different. A man who was confronting his own shortcomings and trying to make amends. "Judge Carter," Maya said, her voice steady. "I'm not sure what exactly this is about, but I'm here. What did you want to discuss?" The judge took a deep breath, and for a moment, it seemed as though the weight of the conversation was heavy on him. "I want to apologize," he said finally, "for what happened in court. I didn't recognize you, Maya. And because of that, I treated you like just another defendant. I issued a fine without considering who you are or the larger context. I acted impulsively." Maya remained quiet, waiting for him to continue. She wasn't sure if she needed the apology, but there was something in his voice that indicated he was genuinely reflecting on his actions. It wasn't often that people in positions of power admitted their mistakes so openly. "You didn't deserve that," Judge Carter added, his eyes meeting hers. "I made an assumption about you, and it was wrong. The truth is, I didn't see you for who you really are, what you've accomplished, the work you're doing, the change you're creating in the system. I should have treated you with more respect, no matter the circumstances." Maya's heart softened at his words. She had been prepared for an apology, but not one that felt so real, so self-aware. There was a sincerity in his tone that made her reconsider her initial wariness. She had come into the meeting expecting to hear a formality, but what she was hearing now was something different. "You didn't have to do this," Maya said after a beat. "I understand that mistakes happen, and you're only human. But I appreciate the gesture, Judge Carter. It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong." There was a long pause as the judge absorbed her words. The room felt quieter, almost reflective, as both of them sat in the space between apology and understanding. "I know I can't undo what happened," Judge Carter said, "but I'd like to do better. I want to be better. I spent so long holding onto my beliefs about what's fair and just, but I'm beginning to understand how important it is to also look beyond the surface, beyond the law itself." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "We all need to learn and grow, Judge. That's what keeps us moving forward." The words hung in the air between them. For the first time since their brief courtroom exchange, Maya felt something shift, not just in Judge Carter, but in herself as well. The conversation wasn't over, but it had marked the beginning of a new understanding, one that Maya hoped would ripple out far beyond the walls of this small conference room. As Judge Carter left the meeting with Maya Sinclair, he felt a weight he hadn't realized he had been carrying for years begin to lift. It wasn't the kind of shift that happens overnight, but something inside him had changed. The conversation with Maya had forced him to confront aspects of himself that he had long kept buried: his assumptions, his biases, his rigid understanding of justice. And in that moment, he realized he had been playing a role, following a script that was comfortable but flawed. As he walked through the quiet hallways of the courthouse, his mind buzzed with reflections. Maya's grace in accepting his apology had caught him off guard. She hadn't been angry, hadn't made him feel small. She had simply listened, acknowledged the mistake, and given him the room to grow. It was the kind of maturity he hadn't expected from someone so young, and it struck him deeply. Judge Carter had spent years in the legal system, priding himself on his unwavering commitment to the law. But now he began to question whether he had truly understood what that commitment meant. He had been quick to judge Maya, quick to impose consequences without fully seeing the person before him. But through their brief interaction, he had learned something vital. Justice wasn't just about the law. It was about understanding the individuals who walked through his courtroom, seeing them as whole people, not just cases. Over the following weeks, the change in Judge Carter was noticeable to those around him. His decisions began to reflect a deeper consideration of the individuals involved, not just the legal facts of their cases. He started to listen more carefully to the context behind each action, asking questions he hadn't asked before, showing empathy where he had once shown only sternness. It wasn't that he had become lenient, but he had become more thoughtful, more human. He found himself revisiting his past rulings, reflecting on cases where he had acted too quickly or too harshly. And in doing so, he discovered a deeper understanding of the very system he had spent his career upholding. The law was important, but it was only one piece of the puzzle. He had to balance it with fairness, compassion, and the willingness to see beyond the surface. But none of this would have happened without Maya. Her calmness in the face of his mistake had offered him an example he could follow, a model of how to navigate the complexities of justice. In a world that often prized power over humility, Maya Sinclair had shown him that strength wasn't just about authority. It was about self-awareness and the courage to change. One evening, as he reviewed a case involving a young defendant in a similar situation to Maya's, Judge Carter felt a sudden surge of clarity. He knew that the work he had ahead of him wouldn't be easy, and he still had a long way to go. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path, one that required not just legal expertise, but a deeper understanding of the people who came before him. Maya had unknowingly given him that gift, and for that, he would be forever grateful. Months passed, and Maya's life continued on its relentless trajectory. She kept working tirelessly, challenging the status quo and pushing boundaries in the legal world. Despite the attention surrounding her as the youngest federal court appointee, she kept her focus on her work. The spotlight had never been something she sought, but it was undeniable, and she used it to further her cause, to reform a system that often felt broken and outdated. But even as she rose, there was one thing she hadn't expected: the ripple effect of her brief encounter with Judge Carter. That single moment, where a mistake had been made and then rectified, had sparked something in the heart of a man who had spent decades entrenched in the system. In a way, Maya had become part of a larger shift, one that went beyond a simple apology in a conference room. It was a change in perspective, in how justice could be balanced with understanding. And that change had spread. Judge Carter, though still committed to his work, had become a different person. His decisions were more considered, more empathetic. He was no longer the stern figure who handed down rulings without a second thought. His colleagues noticed, and even the defendants who appeared in his courtroom began to sense the shift. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the way he spoke, in the way he considered the stories behind each case. People began to see him not just as a judge, but as someone who genuinely sought to understand the complexities of those who appeared before him. For Maya, the experience had been an unexpected one. She had never imagined her brief moment of being misunderstood would lead to such a profound transformation in someone else. When she heard whispers around the courthouse about the changes in Judge Carter's rulings, she couldn't help but reflect on their meeting. She hadn't set out to change anything. She hadn't asked for anything more than respect. But somehow, the conversation had inspired a shift, not just in him, but in the larger system. One day, Maya found herself walking through the same courthouse where it all began. She had a meeting scheduled with another judge, but as she passed by Judge Carter's courtroom, something urged her to stop. She hadn't spoken to him since their meeting, and part of her wondered if the change had truly stuck, if it had been more than just a fleeting moment. She paused outside his door, unsure whether to knock. But then, before she could second-guess herself, she heard the unmistakable sound of the gavel. She peeked inside, and there he was, presiding over a case with his usual poise. But there was something different in the way he spoke. There was patience in his voice, an openness that had been missing the day she had stood in his courtroom. As Maya stood there, watching from the doorway, she smiled. It wasn't just the legal system that needed reform. It was people. And people, Maya realized, could change too. The system could change, one individual at a time. She quietly walked away, knowing that both she and Judge Carter had taken steps toward something better, toward a more compassionate, understanding approach to justice. And in that quiet hallway, Maya Sinclair felt the weight of progress settling in, not just for her, but for a system that might one day look at its people with a little more care, a little more humanity.